My name is Ed McNamara. I'm Director of Planning for Department of Public Service. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about Comprehensive Energy Plan. And especially the focus of today is to really understand what other folks are doing. Can you go right on to the next slide, please, Ann? Thanks. So Department of Public Service is state energy office. Every 6 years we develop a comprehensive energy plan. It's important though, we recognize we're not the only entity that does energy planning in the state. We've got regional planning commissions, municipalities also doing energy plans. You've got energy committees and commissions throughout the different municipalities and towns across the state. So as we're developing our statewide comprehensive energy plan, it's really important to hear from you folks as to what you're doing. That helps us inform our plan, makes it a better plan, and creates hopefully a better feedback loop as we do more planning that can hopefully help inform your plans, which then informs our plans. So tonight is primarily going to be hearing from some of the regional planning commissions, and we've actually got somewhat of a structure here. So I'm going to turn it over to Cindy Cook, who is our facilitator tonight. And Ann, could you, next slide, please? Thank you. Cindy Cook is with Adamant Accord. Also working with her is Dave Lamont, who used to be planning director for Department of Public Service. And Cindy is going to provide a brief overview and go through our agenda for today. Cindy?
Thanks, Ed, and welcome everyone. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Ann. I want to talk a little bit about the forum etiquette. We're asked, the full guidelines are on the website with this URL that's posted. The two key points are please remain muted with your video off during the presentation. That will help with bandwidth for folks and have a better sound and video quality. And you'll have several opportunities to ask questions and to comment. We ask that you raise your hand, use it through Zoom, or and pose any questions that you have during the course of the presentations in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that and then respond once the 3 RPC presentations are finished. So we'll have first, let's move on to the I'll review the agenda in a minute, but a little bit more about etiquette. We ask that you be concise, as in most meetings. There will be opportunity for discussion and public comment. And for those of you who joined late, you may not have seen that this Zoom call is being recorded and will be posted on the website. So just wanted you to be aware of that. So the agenda, we're at the 4:10 slot, reviewing it now. First, we'll start with the Public Service Department. We'll do an overview of the Comprehensive Energy Plan. There'll be an opportunity for informational questions, not getting into the substance of energy issues so much as asking about how the Comprehensive Energy Plan development process works in the first set of questions. Then we'll move on to the regional planning commissions, and each of the 3 commissions that's here today will give a presentation. Again, you'll have an opportunity for informational questions. We ask that you hold those till all 3 of the RPCs have done their presentations. Once you've asked any informational questions of the regional planning commissions, the municipal officials will have an opportunity to provide input regarding the Comprehensive Energy Plan development. We'll have discussion at that point, hopefully have an opportunity to get into some of the issues in some greater depth. And at 5:45, we'll have an opportunity for those who want to comment who haven't already done so, can do so. That if you want to comment during that period, please note that through the chat or raising hand functions. And then we'll talk about next steps and future opportunities for input, and we'll adjourn. One thing I didn't mention is those participants who are on just by phone rather than through on the online application. Do we have any people here that are in that mode, Philip, or?
We do not have anyone on the phone exclusively at this time.
Okay, great. If you would let me know through chat, that would be great. So, so any questions on the agenda? Excellent. So we'll just, I believe now it's next slide. I believe it's my opportunity to pass it back to Ed for the overview of the comprehensive energy plan. So thanks, Ed.
Great, thank you. And I was remiss, I forgot to mention, we've got several PSD staffers on the call helping make this all happen. So to the extent there's some questions, I might kick it over to those folks. Next slide, Ann, please. So comprehensive energy plan is informed heavily by statute, and there's a lot of policy statements throughout statute, but the most significant and sort of the bedrock principles come from this particular area, section 202A of statute, essentially saying that the basis of Vermont energy policy, it has to be reliable, it has to be affordable, and it has to be sustainable. I'm sure several folks are aware of the Global Warming Solutions Act that was recently passed that puts into place not greenhouse gas reduction goals, but actual requirements. So the comprehensive energy plan that we're going to be developing is designed to meet those GHG requirements in an affordable manner while maintaining system reliability. Next slide, please. And I'll be talking about comprehensive energy plan, CEP. It's actually two different plans. The statute requires, for years, for decades, there was simply an electric plan. How do you meet the needs of the electric ratepayers on a 20-year basis at least cost? Relatively recently, in the last 10, 15 years or so, that was expanded to include all comprehensive energy planning. So heating and transportation being the most significant. And this is a document that we prepare every 6 years. So every 6 years, last one was 2016. So we expect to we will have a final in January 2022. Next slide, please. So I already mentioned the GHG reduction requirements. Most relevant for today's meeting, though, is the comprehensive energy plan also has to develop standards and recommendations for enhanced energy planning. And for the folks involved at the regional planning commissions and probably a lot of the folks on this call are familiar with Act 174, which was a mandate that regional planning commissions do enhanced energy planning, essentially to meet the energy goals of the state. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the existing CEP was finished in 2016. The overall recommendation was 90% renewable in all sectors, so heating, transportation, and electric by 2050. There's about 300 recommendations scattered throughout this roughly 300-page document. Next slide. So as our jumping off point, we're keeping the 90% renewable by 2050. Excuse me, that's the starting point. Also on here as well is the GHG reduction requirements that are set in place now with the Global Warming Solutions Act. So the 90% renewable also dovetails really well with GHG reductions as well. Next slide. I mentioned earlier the Global Warming Solutions Act that created a climate council. That's I believe, 23-member organization, appointees by the legislature and administration staff members as well. So they're tasked with creating a climate action plan and essentially identifying cost-effective GHG reduction measures, creating a more resilient system overall, including for municipalities, and also dealing with some of the non-energy issues as well, forest sequestration, any other non-energy GHG sort of emission, industrial processes, things like that. So this slide simply shows climate action plan being developed by the Climate Council on the far left, comprehensive energy plan on the far right as you're looking at the screen, and just essentially showing that there's a significant overlap between these two plans. And just for folks, we are working with the Climate Council. There's a number of PSD staff that are involved in the Climate Council, and we are working to try to dovetail the stakeholder processes to the extent practical moving forward with this. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier, the 2016, the existing comprehensive energy plan has about 300 recommendations, really large document. For the 2022 version, what we're thinking is focus much more on a strategic plan. And by that, we mean we look at the trade-offs among different policies, look at milestones for identifying success and the need for modification. The example here could be in electric vehicles. If all car manufacturers are only doing EVs in 2035, likely you do not need incentives anymore for electric vehicles. Uncertainties that could affect policy success is something also that we're going to be looking at as a strategic component. That could be what happens if lithium mines shut down worldwide. What do we do then? Where should we shift our focus? On electric vehicles or decarbonizing the transportation sector. Also, this CEP is going to include, I mentioned the Act 174 standards and recommendations for enhanced energy planning, climate and renewable energy pathways. What are the reasonable mitigation measures? How do you recommend those? What are the trade-offs? Again, the electric plan I mentioned, state agency energy plan is essentially the lead by example. State government is one of the largest users of energy in the state. What is the state doing for its facilities? What are they doing for EV charging? What are they doing for weatherizing? So that component will be an addendum to the 2022 Comprehensive Energy Plan as well. Next slide, please. In addition to some of the narrative and policy analysis, we're actually doing some quantitative analysis as well. And we're using the low emissions analysis platform, or the LEAP model. This is something that we used with the last comprehensive energy plan. Starting off with a reference case, essentially what happens if we do nothing, and then modeling out different pathways for how we actually get to the GHG reduction requirements that we need in all the different sectors, transportation, heating, and electricity. So it's scenario-based modeling tool, tracks consumption and also production, and then it can also track to some degree the resources in all the different sectors. And the plan after the statewide results is to then look at the regional to help with the regional planning commissions to help with their planning process as well. Next slide, please. So just to give a sense of the overall timeline. So we're just in now, in June, we're doing regional forum, some of the stakeholder meetings. We're also going to do some topical stakeholder meetings as well on electricity, heating, transportation, much more targeted to sector specific or technology or strategy specific meetings. The modeling is ongoing right now. We expect to have most of the modeling complete by August. And then at the very end of August, sometime in September, we're going to have a draft CEP that's going to be published. With the opportunity for written comments, we'll have some additional public hearings at that time. And then the final CEP is published in January of 2022. Next slide, please.
Great. So thanks, Ed. And I'm going to field any questions now for the department. Does anybody have any questions about what Ed just reviewed? I don't see any hands raised, and I don't see anything in chat. You're mute. Most of you are muted, so you'll need to put something into the chat function, which is down at the bottom of your screen, or raise your hand if you'd like to speak.
Cindy, here's a question from the chat from Diane. She asks for a little bit more information about LEAP,
Great.
The modeling tool.
So over to you, Ed.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, Philip, you're the one on this call most familiar with LEAP. Can you provide a little bit more detail than I went into?
Sure. So LEAP which originally stood for long-term, and now I think stands for Long-Range Energy Alternatives Planning, although I may have the acronym wrong. It is a software tool developed by SEI, an environmental organization, that models energy use and resulting emissions in all sectors of the economy, in sort of all human activity. But obviously, we are focusing on the sectors that we often break down emissions into: energy use and emissions. So transportation, buildings, and electricity. And it's a way, in some ways, to let us calculate or estimate emissions emissions reductions through different policy pathways. So that could be based on, and these are the actual numbers used in the model: how many electric vehicles there are, what's the underlying electric source for fueling electric vehicles or for heat pumps, what's the energy efficiency of buildings, and so on. And so it lets us model out to 2050 based on current trends and historical data, where emissions will be changing in the future. With sort of the current business as usual case, but also if different policies were enacted.
And if I could just add, I think you'll see in the forthcoming presentations from the regional planning commissions that they used this same tool. The acronym was a little bit different then, but it's the same tool that originated out of Stockholm Energy Institute for some of the modeling that appears in their plans. And the original use of those was actually, of that modeling came from the work that VEIC did on the Solar Pathways report for Vermont. This was, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. So there is consistency and continuity in terms of the model being used. And then we've made sure that, when we do the statewide modeling, we're going to break it down for the use by the regions again. So hopefully there's going to be, growing familiarity with using this model and the inputs and assumptions, both by the department and the regions, and hopefully in their work with the municipalities too.
And then there's a follow-up question from Susanna, and I just to confirm, is LEAP Vermont specific? And yes, it is.
And Philip, if I could just, the assumptions going into the model are Vermont specific, except for to the extent that Vermont is in the context of a regional and national, in which case we're also using some regional data as well. And it is also a model that many other states have used as well to look at their version of Global Warming Solutions Act to model out different scenarios, if I'm getting that correct.
Yes. Yeah, especially since electrical, New England's electric system is really a regional, it's organized at the regional level. That includes regional data and even regional scenario planning, since our electric grid is so tied to the 5 other New England states. And there's one follow-up question from Diane, which is, are you also planning for the human component, meaning reticence and action and an ability to afford various initiatives?
Thanks. And for that, it's a great question. It's not something that we are including in the LEAP model itself. It is something that we're doing in the strategic planning component of the comprehensive energy plan. In other words, when we do an analysis of policies, we need to look at inequities of program design. For example, are some programs utilized more by certain income brackets than others? That gets to your affordability. I think the reticence and inaction is looking at the overall program designs and essentially, are there trade-offs? Well, there's always trade-offs among policies, but recognizing that there's no perfect policy. And so having to do this somewhat qualitative analysis or fairly qualitative analysis. Hopefully that's somewhat helpful.
Hey, Ed. Sorry, yes. No, not to interrupt. It's Chris Campany. You may just want to mention there that I know there are 2 separate things and I'm not crossing them over, but under the climate action plan, one of the directives is to establish just transitions principles. And if folk want a preview of that, I serve on the Just Transition subcommittee. I serve on the council, also serve on that Just Transition subcommittee. And the draft principles are pretty much complete, going to the subcommittees and the council and all for consideration. Again, I'm not trying to confuse the CEP with the climate action plan, but a lot of thinking's been going into like frontline communities, and so it doesn't necessarily get to the hesitancies, but it definitely gets to public participation in the development of that council's plan, and how to try to address any inequities. So I'll just throw that out there. So I hope you didn't mind my saying that.
No, appreciate that. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be looking at equity in the comprehensive energy plan. And also importantly, we are working with the folks in the Climate Council and development of climate action plan.
And there's one more question, which is a follow-up from Diane asking, is there also planning for updating Vermont's grid, or will that have to wait for federal action? And I'll let you answer it, Ed, but also point out that Velco, the state's transmission operator, is finalizing its long-range transmission plan. So if you're talking about grid transmission, that's a process that is just wrapping up right now. But the public draft of the long-range transmission plan is on Velco's website.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. The only other part I would add is, as I mentioned earlier, comprehensive energy plan includes an electric plan component. What we're really going to be focusing on this time around is essentially grid choreography. When you have large amounts of flexible loads like electric vehicles, heat pumps, in other words, electric vehicle can be charged at night in the middle of the day, obviously depending on whether people are using it at the time. How do you encourage folks to charge off peak? How do you encourage minimizing impacts of electric vehicles and heat pumps on the electric grid? How do you optimize the location and the use of distributed generation as well? It is something that the planning process is definitely calling out for, is better optimization of the grid.
Are there any other informational questions that people have? This is mostly, we're wanting to focus mostly on the process for developing the plan rather than getting too much into the substance right now, because we'll have some more time later for those in-depth conversations. But anything else? Go ahead.
I see also a question about satisfied with progress the Vermont Climate Council has made. Honestly, I'd really want tonight to focus on the comprehensive energy plan instead of getting into discussions about the Climate Council at this point.
Right. So with that, I don't see other raised hands. I'll suggest that we move on into the next slide, which is the opening for the regional energy, the regional energy planning presentations from the regional planning commissions. That's easy to say, right? So first off, we're going to have Otis Monroe from the Mount Scottney Regional Commission. Next slide, please, Anne. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Otis.
Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, I'm Otis Monroe. I work on energy planning, among other things, here at the Mount Scottney Regional Commission. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're the sort of 10 southernmost towns of Windsor County. And that's my contact information if you're in the area and interested in sort of continuing these conversations on the regional or town level. So next slide, please. So I'm going to start just going over the goals and strategies in our regional energy plan. This is taken out of the LEAP model that was discussed before. As you can see, there's a pretty considerable drop in the use of energy by 2050 in the model, and very similar to the rest of the state of Vermont, transportation and thermal, sort of home and commercial heating, are going to have to be a really big part of that. So we have a couple overall strategies for that you see on the screen, mostly around awareness, some electrification goals, and then promotion of sort of alternative transportation to single occupancy, internal combustion travel. And then on the land use side, we obviously are very involved in land use planning as well. And so that's a big part of what we do and a big part of the plan and promoting land use that saves energy. We'll get into more detail on some of these when I get into the challenges. So next slide, please. And then the next main sort of overall goal and strategy part of it is on energy generation, renewable generation itself. We focus in our region on support for solar. Solar is really what we're going to end up leaning on pretty heavily to meet our goals, as well as residential scale wind. There wasn't a lot of support for utility scale wind back when we first wrote this plan in around 2015, 2016. I don't think that's changed much in the meantime. And then there's also some consideration for hydro and biomass. So here I've just sort of highlighted the goal and then where we were in 2015, I believe, or where our 2025 goal and where we were in 2015. So quite the gap. Oh, and we are focusing on promoting generation for now on preferred sites. And I'll get into that a little bit later as well. So next slide. So to dive in a little more detail into each of these sectors, I'll start with thermal. So weatherization is going to have to be a very big part, as with the rest of the state again, for meeting our goals and reducing consumption on the thermal side. There are several challenges with that. The first off is just data on it. It's really hard, it turns out, to quantify or to categorize what weatherization means. It's not as simple as sort of just installing a heat pump. That's very easy to measure. Someone's done it. They go through the incentive process, we can track it. It's good. There's a lot more DIY. There are a lot of incremental projects, which all are great, but make it much more difficult to track where we are and what's working and what isn't. So that's one thing we want to look at going forward, is how to better track what we're doing and what's actually helping to get this work done. Another challenge in our region, and this also is probably fairly similar across the state, this older homes sort of graphic is taken out of what's called the Keys to the Valley project, which Two Rivers, who's also on here, and Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Commission in New Hampshire is a project the three of us worked on housing challenges, the housing crisis in the area. But one thing we found is that there are a lot of older homes in our region. And so from an energy perspective, those are more expensive to weatherize and to heat, and more difficult to, they have older heating systems, they're not as buttoned up. And so that's a challenge across fuel switching and weatherization on the thermal side. And this isn't even across our region. If you know our region at all, towns like Windsor and Springfield are sort of older towns. They have a much older housing stock than maybe your West Windsor or some of the other towns. So they have, even when you drill down to that town level, this can be a bigger problem in some places than in others. One last thing, a big part of our plan is promoting energy code, building code compliance. And one thing we found since the plan was written is there's really sort of a lack of both capacity on the municipal side. It usually sort of falls on zoning administrators or someone in that role to kind of enforce building code compliance, usually through certificates of occupancy. And it relies a lot on self-reporting. The forms are kind of complicated. So that's something we'd like to see improved on, is sort of both promoting, following the building codes, and then some better sort of follow through to make sure people are actually doing what they're saying they're doing. So I think, yes, next slide, please. So then moving on to the transportation sector. And we are a very rural region. We have a few population centers. As I mentioned before, Springfield and Windsor are some of the large ones, but because of that, people tend to travel far to work and to other destinations, grocery stores, shopping, things like that. They also tend to be outside. Those destinations are largely outside of the region. The biggest one is obviously the Upper Valley with Dartmouth, Hitchcock, and things like that. But we found in general our commuting patterns are really diffuse, both in time. You know, there are some sort of leftover manufacturing large employers in the area who have, and healthcare, of course, also, you know, second shift, third shift, things like that. So time can be an issue with getting people to work, and so is people are going in all sorts of directions, west to Rutland and south to Brattleboro, as well as to the Upper Valley. So when we try to get into some of these more mass transit or transit solutions, that can be a real challenge in reducing those single occupancy vehicle trips. So EVs are going to have to be a big part of the solution in our region. There's just no getting around that. But at the same time, we don't want to forget about the considerable part of our population who, for whatever reason, doesn't have a license, can't afford an EV, is really dependent on walking and biking and transit and things like that. So as we look at what we want our transportation sector to look like going forward, we really don't want to forget about those people. And I wanted to also highlight or mention the sort of, this is our current EV charging network in the region. It's not quite up to date. There's been one in Cavendish since then. But, you know, we're doing pretty good as far as along the major transportation routes. But what we'd like to see is more of these in our downtowns. Again, if you know our region, you can see West Windsor, or West Windsor's also working on getting one. But some of the villages like in Reading, in downtown Windsor, places that we think would be good to see electric vehicle charging. We haven't seen it yet. So that's one thing, sort of getting them. It's great to have them along the highways and the state routes, but getting them into our downtowns, I think, would be great, both from an energy and sort of economic development perspective. So next slide, please. And then to drill in a little more on the electric demand and supply, we've seen sort of over the course of this plan, despite this weird bump in drop in 2019, I'm not sure what's going on there, but in general, going all the way back to 2015, usage has remained pretty constant. It's a pretty even 50-50 split between commercial and residential electricity usage. I've highlighted here on the right, speaking of sort of that Velco long-range transmission plan, this comes straight out of that plan and highlights sort of where we are now, what our existing generation is, and what sort of the grid capacity is for some of this distributed, mostly solar generation. And you can see that, you know, we've got a good deal of space before we hit that cap, but it's also not going to get us to our goal. So we are going to have to start looking on a regional, on a town level, for some projects maybe requiring more storage, requiring more load management, and that gets beyond my level of expertise. But from the planning side, that's something we are going to have to start looking at before too long. And I also wanted to highlight, I'd mentioned before, the importance of preferred sites. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on that, but it's a process where a developer has to apply or has to go to a town and ask for that their development is occurred, like a sign off that they're developing on a preferred site. And we found that how towns approach that and sort of how that's applied can vary really unevenly across our region. And so we'd like to see a little more uniformity. And one thing we've heard from developers is both how essential these preferred site letters are and also how sort of frustrating it can be, how uneven the process can be across our towns. So I wanted to make sure to highlight that as well. And next slide, please. So that I think is pretty much gonna wrap it up for me. I did want to highlight, you know, it's not all bad. I don't know if you noticed, I meant to mention it before on our thermal slide. You can see that things like heat pumps and sort of wood heating were actually on a fairly good trajectory to meet our goals there. And so I wanted to potentially look to that as we look at something like EVs where we're really not there, that might show us a way forward. I know hearing from our energy committees, things like heat pump workshops have been really well attended. And as more people adopt it, they get their friends to install a heat pump. And so maybe we'll see, you know, more outreach on EVs, and as more people start using them, that will follow a similar pattern. And hopefully sort of some of our strategies around what has worked for things like heat pumps might also work for EVs. I also wanted to highlight, I wasn't involved with this, so I don't feel too bad about promoting us here. But just recently we did a sort of brownfield solar, or we were involved. We didn't do the bulk of it. If you guys know the Goodyear plant in Windsor, there was a sort of brownfield redevelopment that ended in a new solar facility there. And so I wanted to highlight one of the sort of opportunities in our region is a lot of these underutilized old industrial and brownfield sites, and how some of these less obtrusive but sites still exist for generations. So we have a lot of opportunities there to maybe not meet our goals, but to at least make a decent strides towards getting there. And one final thing you see on here, we emphasize in our plan a lot sort of ends up on the shoulders of volunteer energy committees, and we found that's sort of asking too much. You know, obviously volunteers, they usually have another job or something like that. It's really a lot to ask. So one thing we'd like to see going forward is some sort of increased capacity at the municipal level to get some of this work done. Because a lot of these goals end up saying, oh, you know, the energy committee will do it. Sometimes there isn't even an energy committee. So that has been a challenge in our area that I wanted to make sure not to go through this without mentioning. So that is it for me. I think we have, well, we have Two Rivers next.
Yep, thanks very much, Otis. And up next is Two Rivers Ottaquiche, and it's Jeff Martin and Tori Littlefield. So over to you two guys.
Great, thank you. So my name is Tori Littlefield. I'm a regional planner with the Two Rivers Ottaquiche Regional Commission, and I have my coworker Jeff Martin here. He's our intermunicipal regional energy coordinator. Our region is what is known as the East Central Vermont, or the Upper Valley. So we're mostly northern Windsor counties and southern Orange counties. So I guess Jeff, take it away. We can go to the next slide.
All right. Yep. So in our region, the kind of our highest level goals are first reducing total energy consumption by nearly 50% by 2050, and then increasing the amount of renewable energy generated in our region by 163 megawatts by 2050. And so on the figure on the right, you can see how this might play out over time as modeled during the last update of the Comprehensive Energy Plan. So there's you see the total amount of energy use shrinking over time and the sources of energy changing as well. And I'll talk more specifically about that on some of the following slides. So next slide, please. So in terms of our overarching strategies, the first one is electrification. So we think that electricity provides the most viable path towards meeting the state's energy goals. Our second overarching strategy is efficiency and conservation. So we know that we can't just rely on fuel switching. We also need to use more efficient products and change how we do things to conserve energy. And then finally, the development of renewables. And in our region, we think that most of that will come from solar. And so in this figure to your right, you can see the blue line here is representing total energy use, and this is shrinking over time, in particular compared to the business as usual scenario, which is represented by that blue dotted line. And that reduction is coming from efficiency, which you can see in that green section of the figure, and then also from switching to renewable energy and moving away from non-renewable energy. Next slide. So next I'll talk about each of the sectors. And so in the thermal sector, one of the challenges that we're facing, just like Otis mentioned, is meeting the weatherization targets in our region. So our region has over 29,000 residential units, and of those only 144 were weatherized as of 2019. So a long way to go to meet our targets in terms of weatherization. This pie chart here, the full circle represents all of the units in our region, and that tiny little sliver of orange represents those that have already been weatherized. And so we also recognize that maybe that progress might be underestimated, kind of like what Otis was talking about. It's hard to get good data on this. And so we've also heard from some of our municipalities that they feel that their numbers are low. The numbers that we have are low compared to their experience. So we think that's worth looking into. But nonetheless, we're definitely behind in weatherization. The figure to the right shows residential energy consumption by fuel type. That's estimated by the LEAP modeling that was done during the last update to the CEP. So you can see a significant reduction in the amount of energy used by residences over time, and also a move away from propane and oil. But the model also anticipates lots of biodiesel use. And right now, there's really virtually no biodiesel used in the residential thermal sector. So we're unsure if biodiesel will be able to meet the thermal energy demands, and would rather try to maximize the amount of heating that comes from electricity using efficient heat pumps. And then in addition to our existing housing stock, and again, Otis mentioned this already, but we're seeing challenges with new construction. So we found that while there is a state energy code, especially when it comes to the residential building energy standards, in practice that code's not really being followed in most situations. And in addition, our towns don't have any way of enforcing the RBs in most cases. So while we're thinking about how towns in our region can increase compliance with the RBs, we think that there's value in strategizing at the state level about how to increase compliance with RBs and strengthening those standards over time. And we recognize that's something the state has been doing, but I wanted to emphasize this issue further. Next slide. And then in the transportation sector, the figure on the left shows regional transportation energy consumption by fuel. And again, this was what was modeled as part of the last update to the CEP. And here there's a heavy reliance on gas and diesel in the early years, with that share drastically shrinking over time, and total energy use in the sector shrinking over time too. But again, as in the thermal sector, there's a really heavy reliance on biodiesel projected in the model. And so we think that more of a focus should be on electrification here. Just because, again, if you look at the 2015 numbers, there's very little biodiesel use, and we're seeing electrification really take off. And also another challenge that we're facing is just the rural nature of our region. There's really limited locations for key centers of employment. So out of the 30 towns in our region, only 7 are considered centers of employment. So there's a lot of driving in our region, and over 3/4 of this happens alone, and less than 0.5% of the trips that are taken to work are by public transit. So we definitely also need to focus on shifting the modes of transportation to alternatives to single occupancy vehicle trips, like carpooling, biking, walking, and public transit. Next slide. And so finally, in terms of the electricity supply, we know we need to ramp up our production of local renewables. And again, as I mentioned before, this will mostly come from solar in the Two Rivers region. But we are facing constraints in both our transmission and distribution systems that could really limit our ability to meet our renewable energy goals. So the table on the left, this comes from data from Velco's 2021 long-range transmission plan. So they think that the optimized solar PV distribution in the Two Rivers region is 98 megawatts. So that's what the transmission system could handle without major upgrades. And our regional target by 2050 is almost double that amount. And that's even before shifting away from a reliance on biodiesel in the thermal and transportation sectors to more electricity use, as I talked about on those last slides. So this could definitely be a major constraint that we think needs to be addressed with the update of the CEP. And then we face similar constraints with the distribution system. So the figure on the right shows the circuit rating for distributed generation in our region. You can see there's a lot of orange and yellow and red as well. So that means that those areas of our region are approaching their max capacity for distributed generation. So definitely both of these constraints need to be addressed in order for us to meet our targets. And next slide.
Okay, so this is where I take over again. So we just wanted to highlight a few things that we've done in our regional energy plan that we've actually implemented. So one thing, it used to be a standalone plan, and we've since incorporated it into our regional plan. So it's easier for folks to cross-reference other policies that go along with our energy plan, such as in land use and transportation. We hired an intermunicipal regional energy coordinator, which is Jeff. And basically he works one-on-one with about 6 communities right now with implementing their energy plans. And he's done a lot of cool projects such as GHG emissions inventories for them. He's done, sorry, I'm blanking right now. He's done some audits for like town offices or town-owned buildings so they can improve their energy consumption and a bunch of other cool things. He's going to be continuing with a couple of new towns over the next year, so we're excited to have some more in the fold. We disseminated information to our communities. We tried to use any data that's available so towns can sort of track their progress towards reaching these energy goals. And something that we recently did was to develop a scorecard of sorts, which showed individual communities their progress towards the state energy goals based on that data that we have available to us. And we've received a lot of great feedback on that, since towns are able to now visualize where they are instead of looking at, numbers in a table and trying to, realize, what really has to be done going forward. Next. And we've worked with quite a few of our communities. As Jeff mentioned, we have 30 towns, and we've probably worked with at least 20 of them doing this energy planning along with what the CEP has and the enhanced energy standards. So we did find some issues and opportunities over the past few years. So the maps, towns found that they're not quite reflective of what is going on. And the maps that I'm referring to are the solar and wind potential maps, and those are created based on a formula that DPS came up with. But a lot of the feedback we get is because the formula uses state data layers. Those aren't updated as often, so it's often not, quite reflective of what's going on in the ground. So we've heard that, having either updated, state data layers or some sort of other mechanism to get a better picture of what's going on in the ground when towns are going through solar and wind siting standards. It is difficult to track our progress towards the goals. We do have some data, but it's not the best data. The weatherization figure that Jeff showed a few slides ago, that's one good example because weatherizations are really hard to track. Efficiency Vermont tracks them through their rebate program, which is a great program, but it doesn't track people who, hire outright or even do DIY weatherization techniques for their home. So that's just one of the many issues for that. And towns feel pressured to meet the goals when many of the goals do rely on residents. I believe someone in the audience mentioned that a lot of this is cost prohibitive for folks, like weatherizing your home in our old housing stock. It gets very expensive. So it's a little stressful for towns when they're writing these plans and they're trying to meet the goals, but it's hard to actually get action from residents to buy EVs or weatherize their home. And the current standards right now make the energy chapters very long in town plans. If anybody's done a town plan, they're typically around 80 pages for a very small community. But if they want to do an enhanced energy plan, they're often 20 to 30 pages long. So that's been an issue that we've been hearing a lot about. But we do see some great opportunities with the new CEP update process this year. So we think that improving the standards to encourage towns to make needier implementation actions, meaning standards that kind of tell them what they should be doing, instead of it generally saying like, oh, you should have a goal around energy consumption. A lot of the towns don't have, not really the imagination to come up with, action items that they can do as we start towards our energy goals. And we also think there should be some flexibility in the standards, so it is not a one-size-fits-all model. Our region is very rural, but we do have some larger towns such as Hartford. There are about 10,000 folks, and our smallest town is Granville at 300. But yeah, they're the same standards, and that can be a little frustrating for really small towns and even for our bigger towns because it's trying to find some middle ground there. And as Jeff said, we want to focus our efforts towards more electrification of our energy use and less towards biodiesel and large scale biomass plants. Though those two aren't really kicking off as much as we all hoped they would. So electrification, we think, is the way to go in our region. And we would also like the standards to address strategies around grid distribution and transmission issues, as said in the VELCO long range transmission plan. Next. So just to conclude, some key takeaways and potential improvements to the comprehensive energy plan. So we think requiring meatier implementation measures and policies for communities to meet their goals is a good idea. Many towns think the standards are just a checkbox and not something implementable in the sense that it's not really telling them, specifically what to do. And we think de-emphasizing the solar and wind potential mapping component of the standards is a potential improvement. Most of the applications, Section 248 applications that the RPC received in our region in the past 5 years, many are not located in these prime solar or wind locations that the mapping exercise has you looked at. So that is something we've definitely noticed. And definitely strategizing around transmission and distribution issues. Circuits are overloaded. There's not enough capacity in existing transmission lines to meet the renewable energy goals, so on and so forth. But that concludes Two Rivers' presentation.
Thank you, Tori and Jeff. And we're going to move on now to the Windham Regional Commission, and I believe that's Margot Gia. Margot?
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here this evening. So my name is Margot Gia, and I'm the regional planner at Windham Regional Commission. And so we're going to talk a little bit about our energy plan and our regional energy plan, and some ideas that we've been seeing for opportunities from this region and ideas that might help in the overall comprehensive energy planning process. So next slide. So our overarching goals, when you look at our regional energy plan, is very similar to some of the things that you've been hearing from the other RPCs, but increasing the efficiency of energy dependent systems, looking at local energy options that benefit our communities, and supporting affordable and reliable production and delivery of energy to the area. So next slide, please. So when you start to break down some of those overarching goals, you're looking at some of the action steps or things that Windham Regional supports. So some of these things, and there's a lot of components to the energy planning, but looking at, and one of the things that we wanted to really focus on was improving energy conservation and efficiency strategies as a preferred alternative versus construction of new energy generation. Encouraging development that meets the highest standards and best management practices for energy conservation, supporting the development of energy facilities and sources that provide competitively priced energy, and making sure that there's a diversification of energy sources in our region. And as we're diversifying that, also moving towards a socially and ecologically sensitive energy sources. One thing that has been successful, that we do have a few farms that have put in methane digesters, and so encouraging more of that type of development. Supporting the use of renewable energy resources that enhance energy system capacity and security, and using sound siting practices when installing energy facilities. So next slide. So some of the key strategies that Windham Regional has been looking at to meet these goals and strategies is in the thermal and the heating sector. Weatherization of how existing housing stock is one of the most critical things that has been identified that we can do. And a lot of this is due to the age of the housing stock, as we've heard from the other regions. It's definitely also true down here in the Windham region. In the transportation realm, this conversion to electric passenger vehicles. For electricity, having residents upgrade their electrical appliances and equipment. And for energy generation, we currently have in the Windham region wind and some large scale wind, as well as two large hydro generation stations. And therefore, for our plan, we are emphasizing solar generation as the preferred and area of focus for new development of energy in our region. All right, next slide. So when we look at the Windham region as an overall area in southeastern Vermont, one of the interesting things is we are one of the most heavily forested counties in the state, and 86% of Windham's region is forested, and there's a strong forestry industry here. And so the idea that we can capitalize in the Windham region is on this forestry industry and really focusing on becoming a hub for biomass and applying it to the heating sector. So when the Vermont Yankee closure settlement happened, Vermont Yankee is in one of the communities in our region, or was, and the state gave Windham Regional opportunity to develop a couple programs, the Windham Wood Heat Initiative and the Regional Renewable Energy Program. And these programs helped and assisted our municipalities, so public buildings and things like schools and municipal buildings and public serving and businesses with a chance to convert their systems either into advanced wood heat systems or by looking at some solar or doing audits of their facilities to help explore which options are best for them. So if you can take a look, in this slide, you can see that under these two different programs, we're reduced, over 3,000 tons of CO2 has been replaced in the region through these two programs. And again, when we're looking at which opportunities are going to be a higher level of energy production, we're looking at either probably wind or solar. And our region has had a higher faced substantial local concern around wind production. And so solar generation has really been the focus of what our communities are looking at in terms of future production. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that we've faced, if we're taking a look, say, at the transportation sector, that like many of the communities throughout Vermont, or many of them, our region is very rural. Most of our municipalities are fairly rural, and therefore public transport or personal transportation is often regarded as a necessity. So one of the things that we can, as a regional planning commission, are looking at is helping our municipalities increase the focus on land use planning so that this will reduce the need or the desire to have the distances to drive. The more that we can emphasize increasing our infrastructure in our communities, existing communities, then that, like water and wastewater, that will allow for development of all kinds of facilities within a community that makes for less trips outside of that community. However, even with compact settlement, we're still going to face the problem that existing development's not going to go away, and it's still going to leave high transportation usage. So there's still going to be a need, even with increased compact settlement, on developing ways to have people share rides through park and rides, access to public transportation, car share, bike shares, and other modes of transportation. So next slide. So in our town energy planning, some of the challenges that we have faced, again, particularly our rural communities are often reliant on volunteers, our energy committees, and they often have little time to put into it, and sometimes even expertise to help achieve the energy reduction goals. It's a lot to ask of these very dedicated volunteers, but they need a lot of assistance. And so, you know, some of the things that can assist with that would be providing funding to provide like a full-time energy planner that can assist towns in developing plans and actions, and making sure that municipalities have ready access to updated energy data. And there's also what we find in the town energy planning. The town energy committees are very wonderfully focused on weatherization, and depending on the energy committee, often looking at conversion to electricity as fuel. And those are incredibly important, but they're not often understanding the relationship between energy and town land use planning. And there's a whole level of energy planning that's very critical in that nexus. So having increasing sort of the education of energy committees so that towns, town use land planning and energy planning kind of go a little bit more hand in hand. And next slide. So some of the ideas for the comprehensive energy plan that might want to be considered is, you know, again, this idea of land use planning is energy planning. And that if we're looking and wanting compact settlement so that it reduces transportation trips and is allowing for more compact settlement, then we need to really be relying on building the infrastructure within our communities to allow things such, for example, building wastewater or water systems that can meet future need for compact settlement. And that's going to therefore lead to energy, mostly in transportation, reduction, number of trips. One of the things that we also have talked about is just how the comprehensive energy plan should pair up with the state climate plan. And I know that there's that nexus of overlap between the two that has already been talked about this evening. And, you know, having candid discussions between the two plans and two groups is critical for how we move forward with energy policy goals in the state. So next slide. And just a few more ideas is that we must look, and I think this has even been addressed this evening, is that we must look at household level changes necessary for implementation and be aware that, you know, we're asking towns to work with individuals to change their patterns and buying habits and energy consumption. And then we have to look at things like, is it affordable? Can people access these energy, the tools and the resources needed to make the changes and not be a burden to a household's economic status? And the last idea is that that the reliance on the electricity from the grid as fuel is that we have to address matters of grid reliability. and including the potential for resiliency zones. And an interesting, my apologies.
No worries. It's okay, Martha.
Hopefully my dogs, you're getting to hear their greeting of my neighbor. So again, apologies for that. But the last item is just that the resilience, that the WRC is working with Green Mountain Power to propose an idea for a resiliency zone strategy. There was a similar project done in Panton, and we're hoping to be able to work on what that would look like in our region down in Southeastern Vermont. So thank you all, and we look forward to hearing if you have any questions or want more further information.
Thanks very much, Margot. So now I'm looking to see if there are people that have clarifying questions about the presentations themselves. So we want to hold off a little bit on getting into in-depth conversation, but if you have a specific targeted question about what you just saw from the presenters, please raise your hand or enter something in chat. And I don't think anybody's joined us on the phone, have they, Philip?
No, they have not.
Okay, so it's all Zoom app people. It looks like we have something from. Okay, so these look like comments so far rather than specific questions. If we don't have any questions, that's fine, and we can move on to the municipal representatives comments. So hearing no comment, no questions.
Cindy, here's a
Yes.
question from Susanna
Sorry.
Lewis. It's for Margot.
Great.
What is considered appropriately scaled biomass?
So that's a great question. So when we're looking at biomass in our region, we are thinking about community scaled biomass or supporting biomass. And again, for heating. So there is definitely some concern that biomass that we hear about for electric generation is not necessarily supportive of energy goals. However, on the heating scale, there has been findings that advanced wood heat systems can really bring us a lot closer to our energy goals. And you know, there's been some talk about trying to unify the forestry industry that's already in our region and trying to produce biomass within our region to support operations within the region. So trying to bring some of that, you know, so community scale, using the resources that are here, producing a product that can then be used by businesses and individuals within the region.
Margot, can I add one more thing?
Certainly.
So like through our the CEDF funding that we received with funding that we used to support renewable energy projects, we did do one cogeneration grant with Allard Lumber. And in that case, they were using waste wood product to both generate heat for their kiln and then also generate electricity with the waste heat too. But that's what we would consider like appropriately scaled. That was a, you know, all around net positive using waste product that they were producing anyway, instead of electricity or oil or other things to both fuel their kiln and generate electricity. Sersosimo has a similar operation. And these are, I don't know if people know our region very well, but those are pretty large scale timber operations. As you know, they're pretty large scale kiln operations, and just the amount of timber that they cut and process each year is pretty substantial. a lot of people don't necessarily understand that about the southeastern corner of the state. We've got the most productive hardwood forests in the state. I think people tend to think of forestry more as maybe a Northeast Kingdom kind of pursuit, but that's one of the reasons why. It was actually the Clean Energy Development Fund that recognized the potential in our region because of that hardwood production. So this is not, having come here from the South, about 11 years ago, this is not, cutting down bottomland hardwood forests in the South, converting those forests into pellets and shipping them off to Europe. This is local wood for local heating systems.
Thanks, Chris. So I want to move us along a little bit, and I'm so that we can get to a conversation that's more global, so to speak. But first, we want to get to the local level, and I think we have another question about CO2 replacement. Is there one of the presenters that can define the term CO2 replacement?
That might have been from my presentation. This is Margot,
Yep.
And from the Windham region. And so when we were looking at these systems that were installed in the public or public facing buildings, the replacement term in that case was used as that is the amount of CO2 that was taken out of oil use. And so it's not taking into consideration then how much might be CO2 might be being generated from the advanced wood heat system going in. So it was just looking at the amount of oil being taken out of production or out of usage. Usage, not production.
Thanks, Margot. So are there other targeted questions for the presenters before we move on to the municipal officials? So hearing none, could you move to the next slide, please, Anne? So we're looking for folks who represent municipalities to speak to these bullets, and I'll just review them. What's most important for the state to consider as it develops the plan to support municipal energy planning, and how can the standards and recommendations for developing municipal Act 174 plans be improved, and what recommendations do you have for municipal enhanced energy planning that the PSD should actively consider as it updates the comprehensive energy plan? So first off, I want to get a sense of how many folks are representing municipalities. If you are here representing a town or city, could you say something in chat, please, or raise your hand? And it would take a minute for people to do that, I think. Great. So if other people could weigh in via raising your hand or chat, Thayer, may I call on you to speak to these questions that you see before you? And I think we need to, Philip, can we unmute Thayer?
Sure, I think he can do it himself, but I'll provide a button. Oh, there he goes.
Yep. Hi, this is Thayer. So I think for us, we don't have an Act Set 174 compliant energy plan, but it's something that we really are, that's actually one of our goals in the next couple of years for our energy committee. And so I'm on this to really learn more information on what we need to be paying attention to, what we need to be tracking, and what information we need to be including. Mm-hmm. We're coming to the party a little bit late, I think. So we're kind of a newbie energy committee and wanting to just hear more about what other municipalities have already done.
Mm-hmm. Fair. May I ask what municipality you work with?
I'm with Guilford, so south, south, south.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
So I want to go back to other municipal representatives' questions and comments in a moment, but somebody on chat has raised a question about raising hand function. And so I just want to review that quickly. One of the simplest way I find to raise one's hand in Zoom is if you're on a Mac, press option 4. Oh, I'm sorry, option Y. And if you're on a PC, you just to hit Alt and you should be able to raise your hand. The other option is to go down to the bottom of the screen, and there's a number of icons, and the rightmost one is reactions. And if you click on that, you'll see a raise the hand function. Okay, great. So give you a moment to raise your hand if you're interested in speaking regarding municipal issues. Okay. Okay, so we have 2 raised hands. Philip, can you help me out here with the queue?
Sure. So Chris Campany from Windham Regional Commission, you raised your hand. I don't know if it was to speak about municipal issues or just to practice on your Mac.
It is. But why don't you let John go first, and I'll go after.
Okay. So John.
Hi. I'm not sure how to send. I sent a question, but I can just read it, I guess. My question is about paying distributed renewable energy producers, homeowners, who generate more solar power than they need, to pay them with cash instead of Green Mountain Power credits that expire. Is that being discussed or thought about? I know that's the way it's done in Massachusetts. To generate a larger source of renewable energy and potentially through microgrids also produce more sustainable local renewable producers instead of everything being at commercial scale.
So can somebody from the department respond to that? I think the question was, is there any, are there places now, or is it being considered how to incentivize smaller scale solar, perhaps by offering cash rather than credits that expire?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's an interesting question. One of the things that we're looking at in the comprehensive energy plan is what are other states doing to incentivize renewable generation. That's not something I was aware that Massachusetts was doing. I'm sure we'll get there as we're sorting through the research. It's not something, short answer, it's not something that we've actively considered, but there's pretty much any option is on the table, I think, on a going forward basis.
Maybe for folks who haven't seen it, we do put out an annual energy report every year, and one of the appendices to it this year was a net metering report that we were required to do by law. So if you could poke around on our site or just contact one of us, and we can get it to you, get the link to you. But there was a separate net metering report that took a deep dive and looked at our net metering program, and also looked at some alternative paths forward for distributed generation compensation.
Great. So could you help us with the next person in the queue? Is that Chris?
That would be Chris Campany.
So what they go?
Hang on a second, Chris, before you go, I just want to see if there are other people that have their hands raised. Okay, sorry to interrupt, Chris, go ahead.
No problem. So I was appointed to the council to represent municipal interests by the House to the Climate Council. Again, that's separate from the CEP, but to my mind, one of the things both the council and the CEP need to, both the climate action plan and the comprehensive energy plan need to address is actually what town capacity is, especially what town capacity is reasonable to expect when it comes to implementing the CEP and the climate action plan. I think we'd benefit from actually asking towns, working with Vermont League of Cities and Towns, regional planning commissions and others to help reach out to towns to see not only what they want to do, but what they can actually do with regard to implementing these plans. Because I think of other in other policy arenas where areas where the state has asked the towns, or basically told the towns, you're going to be planning this, and that's how we're going to implement this policy need, when frankly it may be something that towns just really don't have the capacity to do. And so I think we need to have a real honest conversation throughout the state about what towns and frankly regions too can reasonably be expected to do in terms of both policy development and policy and plan implementation. Because one of the examples I look to, and this is not energy, this is another area, but it's a life safety issue, which is river corridor planning. And the state tries to incentivize that with ERAF, Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, and the take rate on that has really dropped off, because in some cases the towns just don't have the political capacity to actually pass those land use restrictions. And then a lot of towns are already challenged enough with just floodplain administration. So I think we just need to have some real honest conversations about that, because these are critical policy issues to implement. We need to get it right. And having that conversation, I don't think is a bad thing. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So I'm back to you, Philip, on where we are in the queue.
Sure. So there's no one else who's raised a hand to speak, but Diane in the comment tells her story. I'm in the process of forming an energy committee at the municipal level in Windsor. So I'm new at this, but I feel like each Vermont town is pretty much on its own about how it goes about lowering its carbon footprint. It would be so nice down the road if the state provided a blow-by-blow list of steps with details and resources for every step.
Does somebody from the department want to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks for that. Excuse me. We do have some resources available, but not in the way that sort of you're laying out there. I think the comprehensive energy plan, the 2016 plan, it's a big sort of dense document. What we're trying to do, both with the comprehensive energy plan and to some degree the climate council, what climate action plan, is going to be much more directive. It's on the state level. However, I think there is the opportunity to sort of take those state level policies, not just an opportunity, they're sort of intended in the comprehensive energy plan that some of these policies can be regionalized, can be brought down to the smaller scale, down to the municipal scale as well. And I think that assistance, we also have, there's other groups as well, VCAN and some other groups that work with energy committees across the state to provide a little bit more uniformity on that. But there are definitely more resources that the department, PSD can bring in terms of making folks aware of certain resources that we have on our website. For Thermal Clearinghouse website, for example, talks a lot about sort of building heating and what you can do for those resources. But definitely appreciate the comment, and something that we can continue to improve on.
Great, thanks. So Philip, where are we now?
Sure, there's a written comment from Ariel who writes, I've seen almost no help from our Regional Planning Commission to our local energy committee other than facilitating our enhanced energy plan. Perhaps we need funding for RPCs to help energy committees.
I don't know, how far this is fleshed out yet, but there was some modest funding, I guess I could call it, allocated in the budget, the state budget this year to go to regional planning commissions over the next 3 years to increase their capacity to help their municipalities with energy planning and implementation specifically. So I guess I would just say stay tuned on that to hopefully hear more from your regional planning commission. You know, it may not be everything in the kitchen sink that you are looking for, but definitely a starting point. And I guess I just wanted to also make a plug for not a blow-by-blow list or customized to each municipality, but on the department's Act 174 page, in addition to the standards, you can see sets of recommendations for regions and municipalities. These are recommendations that were taken from the last comprehensive energy plan, which we had written before we did the Act 174 standards. So they are definitely taken from the statewide level and sort of culled down to what makes sense for regions and municipalities. So definitely take a look at those. With this forthcoming comprehensive energy plan, we're going to be going into it knowing that one of the things we have to put into it is recommendations for regions and municipalities. So definitely stay tuned for when this next CEP comes out. It will have, you know, recommendations that are tailored for regions and municipalities. And we'd love to hear more from folks who have done the Act 174 enhanced energy planning in terms of whether you use those resources, whether they were helpful, what might be helpful to see next time around, understanding that it's, you know, what might make sense for one municipality with certain demographics or location might be a little different than what makes sense for a different municipality. But in general, I think you'll see it reflective of what you saw in the regional plans in terms of emphasizing conservation and efficiency, electrification of heating and transportation, you know, generally in those thematic areas.
Thanks, Ann. And I see that Jim Sullivan made a comment in chat. And Jim, if you're with us, could you just speak to what you wrote in the chat section?
Sure. Well, there was a significant, as Ann mentioned, that there was some money in the budget that, as far as we know, is going to go through. And there's an allocation to the regional planning commissions to support energy planning and energy plan implementation. And I expect a lot of that work will be directed towards supporting municipalities and local energy committees. As was mentioned by Ann, stay tuned because the allocation to the regional planning commissions, the appropriations isn't exactly ironed out yet, but it should allow for significant staff capacity for support for energy planning and energy plan implementation. We should know more very soon.
And by very soon, what do you mean?
Yeah, the money is being flowing through the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and we have a meeting with them on Thursday. At least we plan to talk with them about that on Thursday. So I hope for a little clarity by the end of the week and for some absolute certainty on this within probably about 2 weeks.
Oh, so by very soon, you mean very soon?
Very soon. Very
Right.
soon. When the money will actually appear and become available, I don't know, but probably sometime this summer.
Great, thank you, Jim.
Yep.
Any follow-up questions on this thread about funding and support for the municipalities? Okay. Other questions or comments from municipal representatives? Philip, do we have anybody that we haven't given the opportunity to speak or in the chat or in the raise hands?
No, I don't see any additional questions.
Okay, great. So what I'd like to do is open this up to members of the public. I think participants have been involved throughout this call, but are there people that have not yet spoken who have comments regarding what we've been talking about that they'd like to have the department staff hear? I'll give you a moment to raise your hand or note something in chat. Okay, hearing none. I haven't seen anything, Philip, have you?
Nope, I haven't seen any additional chat or hands raised.
Are there other issues that you want to, that you as a group want to cover before we wrap up? The department has some comments they want to make in terms of how to be involved going forward. And so I want to just check though before we get into that, because that's just prior to adjournment. Ready for that? So I'm going to pass it over to you, Ed.
Let me just interrupt before you go ahead.
Yeah.
John, I think you may have unmuted yourself. Did you have any additional comments?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess a lot of this has to do, I've been an early adopter in getting a pellet furnace to get rid of oil and doing these various things. At the time we did that 6 or 7 years ago, the state rebate program was less than the cost of the sales tax to buy the boiler. And I'm just wondering what the state is doing to encourage movement towards all sorts of things, from electric vehicles to even using property for creating renewable clean power that could be assisted by, by tweaking. I mean, we have a large piece of property and most of it's in current use, but I don't see much in the way of benefits. I mean, they're because of the way the federal tax laws are written, if you put in a large scale project, you can get substantial rebate for the cost and then plus accelerated depreciation for your investment in that. But for a landowner who just wants to be producing more renewable energy and contributing it, it's pretty hard not to feel that we are subsidizing Green Mountain Power and other regional providers if we get into the net metering program. The net metering program is really about, I don't know, it's not about helping the independent energy producers small scale. And so that's sort of the comment. And also I would like to know if you all are thinking at all about that in terms of how do we have a lot of space available to us in the state, which could be used for photovoltaic power. And I think we're on the verge in the next year or two of seeing storage, battery storage, become quite a bit less expensive than it is now. And in fact, good studies in the Northeast that we really are in a very good position to be generating power in true renewable fashion, not simply Hydro-Quebec, which is destroying the migration routes of elks and stealing indigenous land properties, and then calling it renewable because it's not burning oil, and that's a good thing. But I mean, how do we step up to the plate in terms of actually getting to anything close to what the comprehensive energy plan is talking about doing? That makes sense?
Excuse me. Yeah, it does make sense. And that's something I mentioned earlier. We're looking at what other states are doing. We're also looking at doing a deep dive into, are there policies in Vermont working the way that we think they are? There ways to optimize the policies in Vermont? Are there thinking about different options for promoting renewables at different scales and increasingly at different time periods too, as well? Of with electric vehicles and heat pumps, it's going to be most of our, or we're going to have more usage in the winter time. How do we get renewable resources in the winter? Looking at those issues is going to be something that we're doing a deep dive in the comprehensive energy plan in the process. So.
Can I make a call to you or your office at some point and give you some further thoughts on this?
You absolutely can. Yep. And that's actually a good segue to here's information for further comment. And I'll get back to you in a second there, John. So this is the first on the slide is the website that we have specifically for the comprehensive energy plan development. Has timeline, has upcoming events, some background information as well. There's also, this is the specific email to get a hold of us collectively, all of us working on the CEP. This is the best way to get a hold of, John, if you want to send an email here, just mention my name and we can try to connect.
Excellent.
There's also a button on our website as well for a form, comment form. And then of course, there's always good old fashioned US Postal Service mail will get to us as well. So all of that information for you to be able to provide input, make recommendations, what should we be thinking? And especially I'd encourage, I mean, that's throughout the entire planning process, but especially encourage folks to the extent that you're thinking about the connection between the statewide comprehensive energy plan and the regional and municipal planning efforts as well. So very much encourage those in addition to any comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So are there any other comments before Ed makes some final, has some final words? So back to you, Ed.
If I can actually just interrupt, Ed, there's a question from Susan asking, please discuss the balance or conflict between forest carbon sequestration and utilizing the forest for biomass and home heating.
Yeah, thanks. That's, you saved the easiest question for last. That's one that we're definitely dealing with statewide. I mentioned before, Climate Council is really dealing with sequestration. However, we have mentioned historically biomass as an option, especially for heating, as a lower carbon form of heating than fossil fuel heating. And so it is something that we will continue to work on to look at. We work with the folks at the Department of Forests and Parks over Agency of Natural Resources on this issue. It's definitely an issue that comes up on a regular basis, and it's something that we plan to discuss with Climate Council on a going forward basis. And so sorry, Susan, that I can't be more specific than that, but it's a very weighty topic, and we recognize that there's a lot of issues in there. It's not as easy as simply saying biomass good. There's definitely some caveats and some nuance.
And there's a different question from Susanna. The emphasis on electrification implies that there may be plans to rely on gas for backup generation. What is the CEP going to include regarding natural gas?
Excuse me, that's another really good question. First, in terms of backup generation, I think there's a couple different options. With increasing electrification, obviously increased reliability and increased resilience is an absolute necessity moving forward. Excuse me, there's been some discussion about sort of resilience zones, moving to microgrids. Some things are simply better tree clearing practices for distribution lines. So looking at all those different issues. With respect to CEP and natural gas, we have not had a lot of internal discussion on that yet. This is, we're still early in the stakeholder, getting some public input on this. The last comprehensive energy plan definitely talked about natural gas and the ongoing role. We just finished up some regulatory proceedings with Vermont Gas, where they're looking at increased weatherization. They're also looking at increased amounts of renewable natural gas and the potential to produce hydrogen to also put in their pipes as well. Those are issues that we're definitely going to look at, and not just assume that the status quo with natural gas is what we're going to recommend going forward. But beyond that, I can't say exactly what we're going to have in there. Definitely we need to address natural gas and moving away from the existing natural gas paradigm. It's going to be a necessity to reduce, to get to the GHG reductions in the Global Warming Solutions Act.
If I could just add to some of the discussion that, that we have, and it's, not clear how it'll manifest in the plan or not, but, just to tie the last two questions together, when we think about what are our energy needs, when are they, when do they occur during the year, during the day, what are our resources that are clean or renewable, when do those produce, and do the times match with when our energy needs are? We're increasingly looking at those granular time frames. And if we are relying more on electricity for heating and transportation, and those are really essential services that Vermonters rely on, we definitely need to be leaning into the reliability and the resilience. And so, we start to look at those winter periods, the evenings, long extended cold snaps. How do we make sure that the electricity is there, or especially the heating is there if it's electrified? And that's where there's another sort of leap to discussing biomass, maybe not biomass necessarily from the carbon perspective, although we will look at it through that lens, but also just through the backup, the reliability, the resilience perspective, to make sure Vermonters, if they're relying on electricity for heat, there is, another backup, either electricity source or another thermal source to keep homes warm. So it really is all starting to tie together, and we really are starting to look more granularly, and we'd love to hear from folks about, what are the right lenses? What are the lenses that you think are important?
And I do see that there's another question that just came in about, from Eric, about thoughts as to how other sources of biomass, not trees, hemp, other prolific biomass producers fit into the plan. To date, there's not been a large amount of biomass coming from other resources, and it's unclear. I've definitely heard before about 10 years ago, it was talking about switchgrass as fuel source for anaerobic digestion, and also for biofuels. And so comprehensive energy plan is looking at the primary methods of getting to 90% renewable by 2050. And we're not trying to rule out everything, to the extent that these are coming forward, that these are new technologies that other folks are implementing or getting close to being on the verge of implementing. I guess the more emphasis that we put into the comprehensive energy plan, hopefully that makes sense. In other words, we're not excluding the possibility or assuming that all biomass is from trees. I think we're focusing much more on the energy portion of, as Anne was just mentioning, how do you incorporate biomass into an overall energy perspective, from thinking about picking up some of the heating load and having some of that backup resilience as well during cold streaks. So rather than the actual source, the assumption is probably that biomass for the next several years, biomass trees, for the next several years is going to be the primary fuel, but also not, we're going to have to figure out how to not box out anything else as well.
Other comments on this particular topic?
May I make a comment?
Please, is it John?
Yes, John.
Hi. Yeah, go ahead.
My sister's been living for about 35 years in what we call the cottage, but in reality, it's really a shack, and it was made up of two farm buildings that were put together in the 1920s to create a summer cottage. And she's had a heat pump, a propane Renai burner, and a wood stove, and she almost freezes to death every winter in the hole. So this year she's getting ready to have a knee replacement, and I kind of said, we got to go in here and make sense out of this. And we wound up removing all of the interior walls, doing spray foam inside of that, and then going through and basically, I think probably reducing her burnt component of domestic heat and hot water probably down to 25% of what it's been for the last 35 years. And I think that in all of these things, what drives me is, we have to stop burning things. And it doesn't matter what the source is. When we burn something, we're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that is, there's a momentum to that that's going on. Now, in terms of, we put about 5 kilowatts of solar power on the property in 2014, and it cost about $4.50 a watt. We put another 5 kilowatts in 2017, and it was about $2.50 a watt. And now we're going to add another 10 kilowatts of solar power, and it's about 54 cents a watt for the panels. So the cost on so much of this stuff is coming down so quickly that to assume that we need backup from anything that's involving burning carbon-based fuels, I think we're already past that, really. And I know it's hard, and you say, well, we have to make sure we have the redundancy and the sustainability so that when you've got the cold snap in January or whatever's there. But I think that in all of these things, and I know Quebec has been doing some very interesting work in this, in that they say, if you have an oil burner and you say, I want heat pumps, they'll actually subsidize the heat pumps if you leave your oil burner intact, so that in periods of extreme cold and stuff, they can basically start that up and take your use, your electrical use, it's being 90% of the time, 95% of the time being used to run a heat pump for your domestic heating. You can take that and just for short periods of time, use existing infrastructure, existing oil furnaces and stuff to get through that period where you can't store enough energy, although that is changing really rapidly right now. And I think that one of the things that concerns me about regional or, statewide different comprehensive energy plans is that you've got to keep one eye on the horizon of where this technology, where they're going, because they're moving so quickly. And I would recommend to everyone to keep an eye on the Rocky Mountain Institute. Emory Levins wrote a book called Soft Energy Paths in the early 1980s. And the stuff he said then, it's like Jimmy Carter putting on the cardigan sweater and putting some panels on the roof of the White House. If we had listened, paid attention to that 40 years ago, we would not be sort of like looking out and saying, well, we want to get 90% by 2050. In terms of really the coming generations, this transition has to happen a lot sooner than that. And I think in the electric vehicle realm, we're seeing that, you got General Motors and Ford basically making multi-billion-dollar commitments to get rid of internal combustion engines, diesel engines, all of those things, and move. And increasingly, if you look at those things, you start to see that, like now in the Tesla, the heat pump they have for heating the passenger compartment and stuff is a small DC heat pump that is the kind of thing that could also be used in domestic heat situations and run on DC current rather than AC current. The kinds of current that you can generate and store at very affordable costs. And so I think that we really have to be paying attention, not trying to reinvent wheels, but just spending some time every day. I spend too much time every day seeing what's new and what's coming, because it's extremely exciting. I read today that there are 4,000 miles of irrigation canals in California. And if they put solar panels on top of those, they would save something like 265 billion gallons of water from evaporating, plus generate enough power for 9 million homes in the state of California. So it's, yes.
Jonathan, to jump in for a minute, because you asked earlier about contacting the department to have a more in-depth conversation. And that seems like it's be something that would be really helpful to do.
I will do that as well.
Yeah, because you're obviously have a lot of information and ideas to share. And
I'm an amateur, you know, it's not my job, but I do it because I have children and I want to have grandchildren, and we really need to be, you know, getting out of our comfort zone to look at these things.
I hear the urgency.
Oh, very much.
I think we all feel it. Yeah. So thanks, and please do contact the department. And I think we're ready to wrap up here. Is that right? So any other business we need to attend to before Ed wraps things for us?
I can just read one final comment, which is from Peter, saying there should be at least a thought given for a comprehensive global energy system. It is technologically possible for everyone on the planet to have power at almost zero cost, entirely in harmony with the biosphere. Any more local solution must take into consideration future adaptation to such a system.
Does anybody from the department want to comment on that?
No, I'd just say, yeah, it's important to remember that we've got lots of different scales that we're talking about here, and trying to keep in mind sort of all the way from global all the way down to Guilford, you know, what are we doing on all these different systems, and how do we try to integrate them to the extent possible, recognizing we're all sort of planning at different levels, and this effort really is trying to integrate that planning to the greatest extent possible. So appreciate the comment. I don't see any other comments, and so I do want to thank everybody for participation, especially the folks from the RPCs for their presentations. I thought those are great. It's good to get a sense of what everybody's working on, and really appreciate the recommendations as well for what we ought to be thinking about. Again, we've got different ways of contacting us, different ways of staying in touch. You know, our website, email, snail mail, however you want to do it. But we definitely welcome the comments. And this comprehensive energy plan it's not just a bunch of nerds at the department. It's not just for us. This is actually for the entire state. So the more input we get, the better the plan will be. So appreciate everybody's time tonight. Thank you.
Thanks.